So I have a confession to make. I hate frequency modulation. Frequency modulation sucks. You know why? Because phase modulation's where it's at. I'm partially joking. When I first found out that pretty much all frequency modulation synths is actually implemented as phase modulation, I felt like that meme of the two astronauts where one of them is looking at the Earth and it's all just Ohio, and then he says, it's wait, what was it again? Yeah, where the one where the two astronauts, one of them is looking at the planet and it's just Ohio, and then he was like, wait, it's all Ohio? And then the other one says, it always has been, and then he shoots him. As somebody from Ohio, I think that kind of resonates more with me than it may otherwise. But yeah, it's like that, except it's with phase modulation. And when I first heard about that, I was very confused what exactly that meant. I tried looking it up on YouTube, and I think the only accessible video that I found was but the one by Ghost Hack, where he's talking about where he's using serum, I think, to show the difference between, or he's using serum to show what phase modulation is when you slow down the modulator frequency. And I was really confused by that. I was like, this can't be right, but it turns out he absolutely was right. And it makes sense when you think about it, but it's just, you have to contextualize it into how this stuff is actually implemented. But yeah, when I first saw it, I was very confused. I didn't really get a grasp on it until I read a series of blog posts by this guy called Ken Sheriff, and he blogs about reverse engineering chips and stuff, and he did one on the DX7 by analyzing the chips with dye photos and looking at the circuitry and stuff like that. So I'll link to one of his posts down below, but I also made a PDF of all of his blog posts about the DX7, just so it was easier for me to read on my iPad. So I guess I'll try and find a way to share that too. But it didn't really start to sink in for me until I started using Max MSP, because it's basically programming, so you're building something from the ground up, especially with Gen, which is Max's audio rate DSP platform. So it's actually coding on a per sample basis. So I'm going to try and demonstrate that. I'm going to try and demonstrate the difference as clearly as I can today using Max and Gen. And it's going to get a bit technical, but I think that you can still get a better grasp of what's going on, even if you don't fully understand all the details of it. But I just feel like I have to get to the bottom of things. I'm never really satisfied until I fully understand something. So I tried researching this stuff, and that's why I started making these videos, so I could just share it with other people, so they don't have to go digging around and stuff. But I still support going digging around, so go do that. But I'll just compile some of the resources that I've gathered here. So also, I just wanted to say thank you for everybody who left kind comments on the FM tutorial video. It was really awesome to see how many people it was reaching. It did way better than I expected it to. I just figured it was going to be something that was there for people a few years down the line, but I didn't realize it was going to really take off. And I think it has to do with the fact that I used the Digitone 2 as the thumbnail. But it's fine, because I talked about the Digitone 2, and it's there's going to be a new wave ostensibly of FM users that can find that video helpful if they clicked on it because of the Digitone 2 cover. But I feel like it's probably important that I say that I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I'm not a DSP engineer. I just look this stuff up after work, and I at work I can listen to listening material all day. So I listen to a lot of YouTube videos and lectures and stuff on synthesizers and DSP and other shit. So, but yeah, I'm not an expert in any way. I'm just sharing what I've gathered. If you are an expert or have more experience in this kind of stuff, and you've noticed that I've said something incorrect, you can feel free to leave it down below and we can work it out. But anyway, thank you so much for everybody who, just a ton of comments that were thanking me for making the video. So that was really cool to see. And I said at the end of my last video that I wasn't planning on becoming a YouTuber. And that's because I work full time and just don't have the wherewithal to make a bunch of videos. But I do have some other videos that I wanted to make. So I can't guarantee that I'm going to be, how many videos that I'm going to be making, but there are some of the works, so I will share those. But yeah, I guess we should just get into phase modulation now. So in order to understand phase modulation, you need to understand how pretty much, as far as I can tell, all digital synthesizers work, and that's based on this idea of direct digital synthesis. But first, I want to briefly try and just give an overview of how to calculate a sine wave. You may already know this, but it's worth bearing in mind. So this is a mathematical model called a phase vector, or in short, phasor. This is a model that makes it easier to do certain types of calculations, like in AC circuit analysis or something, but basically it just describes how to calculate a sine wave. So let's look at this blue arrow first, because it's highlighted in the picture. I guess I should just talk about briefly what sine and cosine are. Sine and cosine are ratios of the sides of a triangle, of a right triangle. Sine would be the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse, and cosine would be the ratio of the adjacent side to the hypotenuse. So they're functions that you input an angle, and then it will output the value of the sine and the cosine. So for this angle, this is the value of sine, and then for this angle, and for the same angle, this is the value of cosine. It's said right here. So for our purposes today, you can basically either take the sine of an angle, the sine of a phase, or the cosine of a phase. And this is demonstrated in this picture. So if we take a 30-degree angle, which is the angle that this vector forms with the real number axis, when we take the sine of that angle, when we input that angle into the sine function, it outputs this point on the graph. So this is a 30-degree angle of a sine wave. And the idea of the phase vector is that you take the sine, you input all of these angles into the sine function, and then when you graph that in the time domain, it outputs a sine wave. So that's how you calculate a sine wave mathematically. This is a mathematical model for calculating a sine wave. So here we see that in action. This vector is rotating around the circle, and the angle that it makes with the real number axis, you take that angle and then input it into the sine function, and then it outputs over time a sine wave. And you can see the projection that this phase vector is casting onto the imaginary axis. If you take that shadow that it's casting over time, it just gives you a sine wave. So that's how you calculate a sine wave. And this is important to understand what comes next. I forgot to mention here that this actually doesn't only apply to sine waves, but it can be used to model any waveform. All you have to do is add more vectors to the end of your starting vectors. So the more vectors that you add to the end, the more complex the waveform that you can draw. And in fact, this applies to so many different things outside of music. You've probably heard of it in the context of synthesizers and stuff, how all sound can be decomposed into a series of sine waves at different amplitudes and frequencies. And so that's what this vector model is modeling. Each of the vectors represents a sine wave. And when you add more onto the end of them, then it culminates in something more complex than just a sine wave. But Fourier analysis can be applied to just so many different things. It's crazy, like heat distribution, even economics and stuff. Yeah, Fourier analysis is really interesting. It's one of those things that makes you like see the whole universe in a grain of sand, you know what I mean? This footage is taken from 3 Blue 1 Brown. I'll link to that in the description. You should go check that out if you're interested in Fourier analysis, but it's not specifically about sound, but of course it's relevant to it. But that's how wide-reaching this phase vector model is. So you can do this and turn it into a synthesizer, but this is a bit more computationally expensive to actually calculate the sine of each of these angles. So what's a solution to this? Well, that's where this idea of DDS comes in, or direct digital synthesis. So this is a good article by Analog Devices, and we can just read this really quick. Direct digital synthesis is a method of producing an analog waveform, usually a sine wave, by generating a time-varying signal in digital form and then performing a digital to analog conversion. And it's made up of the same components as what we just saw. So in DDS, the phase vector is called the phase accumulator. I just think it's because that's like what they named the component of this specific application, because a phase vector can be used for other applications, right? But in DDS, it's called a phase accumulator. And then that undergoes a phase to amplitude conversion. So this part is where you actually calculate the sine wave. So this phase accumulator is you can imagine it as going around the circle. And then when you calculate the sine of each of those angles, that's the phase to amplitude converter, because that's when you map it out over time, and that's what gives you a sine wave. But instead of actually calculating the sine of each of those angles, it's more computationally efficient to store those values in a lookup table. So this would be a sine lookup table. These are sine values that a phase vector would create going around a circle, but instead of actually calculating each of them, these values are just stored in memory. So what the phase accumulator is doing is basically, you can just think of it as it's reading through these values. And once it gets to the end, it just starts back over again. And that's how you get an oscillating waveform. And if you send that information out to a DAC, then you just hear a sine wave. And you can see here in this little portion, let's talk more about the phase accumulator. How does it work? Continuous time sinusoidal signals have a repetitive angular phase of 0 to 2 pi. The digital implementation is no different. The counter's carry function allows the phase accumulator to act as a phase wheel or phase vector in the DDS implementation. So you can see that's exactly what this is doing here. Yeah, go check out this article. But that's pretty much all we needed to learn from this, is that the two components to a DDS setup is phase accumulator and then a means of phase to amplitude conversion, which is usually often a sine lookup table, as it says here. So this is, as far as I can tell, pretty much how all digital synthesis is implemented. I mean, there may be other ways of producing an analog waveform, or yeah, like an analog output waveform, like a procedural kind of setup, like where you have something that calculates, you know, directly in the time domain or something like that, some sort of code that calculates an output waveform. In fact, I actually have a max patch that's kind of like that, but this is pretty much how it mostly works for the most part, as far as I can tell. So let's try and make this. So I'm gonna do this in Gen. Okay, so here's a Gen patcher. I can delete this stuff. So lucky for us, in max/gen, we have a phase vector built into it, and that's just called phasor. So let's just look at what this looks like really quick on the scope. So this is what the phasor looks like in a digital system. Instead of being, you know, like I said, that idea of the phase vector rotating around the circle, that's just a mathematical model. It makes more sense in digital systems to implement it as instead a value going from 0 to 1 repeatedly. So this is equivalent to the vector rotating around the phase wheel. When it starts down here, it's at 0, and then it goes around the circle, and then this highest point up here is when it completes the circle. That's the model behind it, but what we get is just a ramp wave that goes from 0 to 1, and you can actually use this as a saw wave, but I would not recommend it in Max. I would recommend using saw instead. But let's just listen to it real quick. So yeah, it just sounds like a saw wave, right? The important part to keep in mind, though, is that it's not going from, it doesn't have a negative portion. It just goes from 0 to 1. You can scale it to make it so it goes negative, but we don't want that for the purposes of our video today. But let's look back at this phasor really quick. You can see it has two inlets. This one is the phasor frequency. So this is the rate at which the phasor goes from 0 to 1, how long it takes for it to go to 0 to 1. So if we send that a number like this, then that will dictate the frequency. So this is a phasor going at 86 hertz. But what we want to do with this signal is use it to read through a table of values corresponding to a sine wave. So we have the cycle operator in Gen. I guess I should probably call it objects and not operators. Everything inside of Gen, okay, so in Max, all of these things are different objects. Inside of Gen, all of these are operators. But since we're dealing with phase modulation today, I'll just call them objects for simplicity. So this cycle object is going to be that means of phase to amplitude conversion that they said in the article. What it is a table of values that correspond to one cycle of a sine wave. So I'm going to use this phasor to index through the values. And what that's going to do is just read through them. So it's indexing through each of these values. So let's listen to what that sounds like. So that's how you make a sine wave in Max. So I should have clarified here, it's how you make a sine wave in Gen specifically. And it's also only one way to make a sine wave, because you can actually do it in a bunch of different ways, of course, being Max/Gen. And actually, using the cycle object is by default a cosine wave, but I didn't feel like mentioning it, but might as well do that now. And so I'm going to show you really quick what the phasor looks like alongside the output of the sine wave. So you can see that the sine wave is going from down here all the way to up here, and then it repeats. So you can see it more clearly this way. When the phasor is at its minimum at 0, that corresponds to the first part of the sine wave. And as the phasor goes up to 1, that's how it reads through the whole sine wave. So this is the beginning of the phasor, and then goes through here, and then that's the end of the phasor. So that was a long way of explaining this, but basically all you need to know is that the way that you generate a signal in digital synthesizers is by using a phase accumulator to read through a table of data or a buffer or something like that. Okay, so I changed the audio so we can actually hear it loop back instead of just coming out my speaker. So, so we know now how to make a sine wave and how to control the frequency of that sine wave, because the frequency is determined by the rate of the phasor, right? So now we can just control the frequency of it with another sine wave, right? And that would be frequency modulation. Yes, that is correct. So let's do that. Okay, so now I have a simple 2-operator frequency modulation patch. And what's going on here is we have this first operator, which consists of the phase accumulator and then the sine lookup table, which outputs the sine wave. So I just duplicated that. I have another phasor that's controlling another sine table. And I'm taking the output of that and going up here, and I'm adding it in with the frequency. So you're going to get the number that comes from this input, and that will dictate the frequency of the phasor. And then you'll also get the number that comes out of this other sine wave, and that will also dictate the frequency of the phasor. Also, really quick, I have another input that's controlling the level of the second operator of the modulator. And the way that you do that is by multiplying the signal by a number. So we have this first one that's dictating the frequency of the carrier, and then we have this second one that dictates the frequency of the modulator, and then we have this third one that dictates the level of the modulator, so the amount. So let's set this to a slow frequency at first. So you can see that second sine wave, the modulator, is now controlling the frequency of the first one. And if we get this high and then turn that up, and we have frequency modulation. So that's how you do frequency modulation in a digital setup like this. But there's some problems with this approach. This is a bit computationally expensive, this setup. And it was especially so in the year 1973, I think, when frequency modulation was patented to Yamaha. So they had to come up with a more efficient way of doing this. And the reason why it's computationally expensive, you need to compute the integral by doing it this way. You have to integrate the modulation signal continuously over time. And you'll be familiar with the concept of integration if you've taken calculus. I haven't. So it's a bit confusing to me, but integration is the sum, calculating the sum of continuous values over time. For example, if you know the velocity of a car at every given moment, then you can calculate the total distance that car travels over time by integrating it. You can integrate the velocity over time. So integrating the velocity at every increment of time will give you the sum total of the distance traveled. So what that means for FM is that basically, so in the car example, the velocity is the rate of change. And with sine waves, or with waveforms, the rate of change of phase is the frequency. So you have to continuously compute the rate of change of phase to get the instantaneous phase at the output waveform. So basically, just think of it like you're computing you're doing calculus at every sample dictated by the sample rate. So back in the 70s and 80s, if you took this approach, your synthesizer would be very expensive. It would end up being very expensive because with the technology back then, that would have taken a lot of computational power. In today's synthesizers and computers, this isn't as much of a problem, but it's still better to save on CPU usage as much as you can. And Yamaha's implementation of that back then, their solution to that problem was phase modulation. So I'm going to take this out and we'll focus back on the first sine wave operator. So we already have this phasor that is reading through the values of this sine lookup table. If you continuously change the frequency of the phasor, then the output waveform is going to come at a computational cost. So what if we just take the output of the second sine wave, and instead of telling it to change the frequency of the phasor, what if we just tell it to read through the carrier's lookup table alongside the phasor, well, that would be phase modulation. So I'm going to add to the phasor signal, and I'm going to take this other sine wave. So before, we had this other sine wave coming up here and being added to the frequency signal of the phasor. Now we have it just being added to the phase signal alongside the phasor. So the plus was just up here before. And surprisingly, this is so much more computationally efficient, and especially so in the 80s. So instead of computing an integral at every sample, we're just going to add this modulating signal as a phase offset to this sine wave. And in doing so, we don't have to calculate an integral because it's not actually controlling the frequency of this sine wave, but instead it's just reading through the sine wave. So that's basically already what we had. We just had a phasor that's reading through a sine lookup table, and we're just adding another signal to read through the lookup table. So these numbers are controlling the same thing as before. So let's give it a low frequency. So that sounds exactly like it did in frequency modulation. It's not actually the same, and I'll get into that later, but it sounds exactly like it. So that's the important part, right? So let's get this moving, and then I'll turn up the frequency of the carrier, of the modulator, I mean. So just to illustrate the point further, this is our sine lookup table, right? We have the phase accumulator that's reading through this linearly. So one after the next, after the next, after the next, and it just goes through all the way to the final sample. What we're doing when we're modulating the phase of this is that we're injecting another signal into this readback. So without any modulation, it would be reading through it like normal. But with modulation, the modulating signal is going to tell it, no, read this one, no, read this one, no, read this one, this one, this one. And it'll just distort the readback of the waveform. So instead of telling the whole thing to go faster and slower, it's just reading the waveform back in a distorted way by causing a phase shift. The first time I actually wrapped my head around this was when I was reading Ken Sheriff's DX7 blog posts. It's pretty dense, but like I said, I'm going to provide the PDF somehow, so you can read through that if you want to. But basically, that's what phase modulation is. Each of these points are just phase values mapped over time. And by using another sine wave to read through it, it just gives us a phase modulated output waveform. So I just added this thing so it can reset the phase of both of these phase accumulators. When it hears the click that I send to it, it just tells both of these phase accumulators to go back to 0. So let's look and listen to that at a 1-to-1 ratio. So by looking at it with just a little bit of modulation, maybe you can try and imagine what's going on behind the scenes here. Hold on. So we start reading back this signal, and when we add another sine wave to also read back this signal, this is the kind of thing that we get, right? You can kind of see the impression of another sine wave being added into the readback of this waveform. And that's why you needed to understand this idea of DDS, because the components of DDS are a phase accumulator and then a lookup table. And in order to modulate the phase, you just tell another sine wave to read back through the lookup table in addition to the phase accumulator. So it's pretty simple, right? So remember when I said in the FM tutorial video that you should never use a saw wave as a modulator in a phase modulation synth? Well, it's time to evidence that claim now. So before I do this, I'm going to just show you something that I used in this patch. So instead of using a regular phase accumulator, I'm going to use an object called triangle. And as you can see, it says it's a triangle/ramp wavetable. But the interesting thing about this one is that it's a value from 0 to 1. So I can use it in the exact same way as I would a phase accumulator, except I have to use the phase accumulator to drive this one. So let me index through this. So I'm just going to show you what this looks like on the scope, and then I can show you how I use it in this other patcher. Oh yeah, first I have to, okay, so here's the other thing. So this is what it looks like normally. And then this other inlet on the triangle object is the duty cycle, and it takes the value from 0 to 1. So what the crap is a duty cycle? You've probably heard that term. used for square waves. And it's basically the same idea here. It just gives you, it changes the peak, like where it's at in its cycle. So let me, okay, so this one's controlling the frequency. And then this is changing the duty cycle of the triangle wavetable. So it can give you a ramp wave, a triangle wave, or a saw wave, and anywhere in between. And as you can see, it only goes from 0 to 1. So instead of using a regular phase accumulator, which would just look like this on a scope, right? I'm going to use this and then show you what it sounds like when I change this duty cycle. So it can give you an idea of what's going on in phase modulation when you don't use sine waves. And then I'm going to show you what it sounds like when you actually phase modulate a signal with a non-sine wave. So let's do that now. So we're only going to look at these for now for simplicity. So I have this triangle object working as a regular phase accumulator. It's going from 0 to 1 repeatedly, and that's being used to read through this sine wave. So you can see that this part of the cycle corresponds to the beginning of the sine wave, and then the last part corresponds to the end. So let's see what happens when our phase accumulator is not linear. Well, it will be linear, but just in a different way. So I'm going to change the duty cycle here. And you see that it gets weird, but if you look closely, you can tell what's going on. So if I just give it a little bit of this, so you have the phase accumulator mostly just normal, but then it has a falling section. It doesn't just go straight to 0 again. It has a ramp, and then it has a decline. So the part of this output waveform that corresponds to the ramp, you can see that the sine wave, the sine table is being read through faster because it gets shorter in the scope. So it's being read through faster because that means that the frequency is increasing, right? But then on this falling section, you get it looks like another sine wave, but backwards, and it's going really fast. So when the phase accumulator is going upwards, it reads through the sine wave like normal. And then when it's going downwards, it reads backwards through the sine wave. If I put this in the middle, so it's actually a triangle, this might be easier to tell what's going on. So on the upward ramp of the phase accumulator, it reads the sine wave normal. And then on the downward ramp, it goes backwards through the wavetable. So when the phase accumulator is going from 0 to 1, it starts at the wavetable from 0 all the way to 1. And then when it's going from 1 to 0, it does that exact thing, just goes backwards through it, 1 to 0. And then it repeats. And remember, there's no phase modulation going on here. It's just using the phase accumulator and changing the shape of the phase accumulator. And this is similar to a technique known as phase distortion, but that's a bit different. And I'll talk about that in a future video, but basically you just need to know that there's no phase modulation going on here. This is just reading through the wavetable like we were before, except instead of just going from 0 to 1, it goes 0, 1, and back to 0. And then what you get is the wavetable being read 0, 1, back to 0. So let's listen to what this sounds like really quick. So you can hear a kind of notch in like the timbre of it, and then it kind of squeezes back into a sine wave. I just wanted to do this to demonstrate further the relationship of the phase and then the amplitude. So, this phase signal, when you change it, the output amplitude of the waveform changes, because now going backwards corresponds to the sine function happening in reverse, right? And then I have a cosine here too, just to demonstrate it further, because this one's kind of interesting. So we'll listen to it while I demonstrate. I like the way that one sounds better when you change the duty cycle. It sounds smoother. That was a sine, and this is a cosine. So the interesting thing about the cosine is that it has half wave symmetry. So this is the beginning of the wave, and then this is the end of the wave. Whereas a sine wave, it only has quarter wave symmetry. It doesn't have half wave. So the sine wave starts here and then here. So the left and the right side look different from each other, but for a cosine wave, the left and the right side look the same. So that gives you an interesting little artifact when you do this and then set it to 5 or 0.5. So the rising and falling portions of the phase accumulator are equal in length. So what that culminates in is the cosine wave sounding like it's being read at twice the frequency, because the upward portion, this portion right here, the upward portion is reading through it like this, and then the downward portion, it's reading through the wavetable backwards like this. So what it sounds like in the end is a sine wave playing at twice the frequency that you started with, because when I go back to normal, you can hear the octave is lower. And that's different from the sine wave because they don't have half-wave symmetry. You know, doing something like this, having a synthesizer like design where you change the duty cycle of, when you have like a phase accumulator that works like this and you can change the duty cycle, that might be an interesting idea for somebody to explore. But anyway, so now we understand what happens when you read through the phase of a waveform differently than just linearly, like 0 to 1. So now I can show you what it sounds like when you add another signal into this mix. So you remember that DDS is an accumulator reading through the table, and phase modulation is adding in another signal to read through the table alongside the phase accumulator. And so far I've just demonstrated that other signal being another sine wave. But what happens if we use a signal like this? And in fact, what happens when we use a saw wave to do it? So that's what I'm going to show you now. So I have another one of those triangle objects set up as a modulator. Of course, you can change the duty cycle of this one too. But right now I have it going 1 to 0. So it's the opposite of the accumulator, and this is more like a traditional saw wave, right? So let's just get this sine wave going, and then I'll bring up the modulation level of this saw wave. It kind of sounds like sync, oscillator sync, if you're syncing a sine wave. And in fact, basically that's what's happening. The same kind of result that you get from oscillator sync is going on here. So let's dig into this a little bit. I have this other scope down here to show what it looks like when you add both of these together. So this is what it looks like after that equation. So this down here is this plus this. It has a larger range, so that's why it only goes up to here right now. The only signal that it's receiving is this original phase accumulator. So when I bring up the mod level, you're going to see this output change because this is going to be added to it. So let's look at what that looks like. So you can see that it starts off going 0 to 1 because that's the original phase accumulator. And the more that I increase the level of this other signal, it starts to invert. And right here, it's just 0. You can see that that equals like nothing on the sine wave. This signal and this signal are just canceling out because they're opposites of each other. So that results in an output wave of nothing. The more that I bring it up, the more this signal starts to become more important. And the higher the level of this modulation signal, the faster it's reading through the wave. And so it sounds like it's going really fast. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, I'm gonna change the duty cycle to a ramp wave. So now both the phase accumulator and the modulation signal are both the same, basically. And you can see here on the scope of the sum of the two of those signals, the more that I bring up the modulation level, the steeper the angle goes from 0 to 1. So if you think about what that means, it's like the time that it takes to go from 0 to 1 is going faster and faster because it has more distance to travel now, but it's doing it in less time. So that means basically it's going faster. And what that gives you on the modulated signal, the output waveform, is that it just gives you a higher frequency, right? So it sounds like oscillator sync. Because for every cycle that this original one dictates, this modulation signal is adding to that and making this angle steeper. And as it gets steeper, it reads through the table faster. So at specific intervals, you just get another sine wave that correspond to harmonic intervals, right? So at 10, it gives you whatever harmonic this is, if you can hear. And then at 8, it gives you a lower one, and then it goes down. So it really is basically oscillator sync, right? That's what you end up with, is a sound that sounds like oscillator sync. So doing this at audio rate, it's easier for me to wrap my head around it, but it might be easier for you to do it at a slower rate. So I'm going to try that now. Okay, so I just threw this one together. So I have a normal operator just with a phase accumulator reading through a cycle. And then instead of another sine wave for the modulator, I have it as set to a triangle, and then we can change the duty cycle to listen to what that sounds like. And I'm going to be playing this modulator signal at a lower frequency, so it might be easier to tell what's going on. So this is the carrier signal, and this is the modulation signal. As I bring up the modulation level, so you can see when the modulation signal is rising, the pitch is higher, and when it's falling, it's lower. Okay, so I quickly copied this one, and instead of phase modulation, I did this one as frequency modulation. So you can see it's controlling the phase accumulator and not being added to the sine wave table. So these are all the same settings as this one, except I just increased the range of the modulation index because you need more gain for frequency modulation than you do for phase. So let's listen to what this sounds like. It's smoothly going from a lower frequency to a higher one. But with the phase modulation example, it's stepping. And that's because remember how phase modulation works. If you have a linear signal that's reading through the waveform, then it does it at a constant frequency, because that's exactly what a phase accumulator does. It reads through the frequency, it reads through the table from 0 to 1, and that corresponds to one full cycle of the output waveform. So what it's doing is when it's going up, it's reading through the table forwards at a certain frequency, and when it's going down, it's reading through the table backwards. So this duty cycle is set to 0.5, so that means the signal is just the same on both sides. It's going up at the same rate that it's going down. And you saw with this patch, when it's a triangle like that, and it takes the same amount of time to go up than it does down, then it reads through the table evenly. So why does it have a different pitch this way? Wouldn't it have the same pitch going up and down? The reason why it's not is because remember that this is the modulation signal and it's being added to the phase accumulator signal. So that ends up being when this one rises and when it falls, when you add both of these values alongside a phase accumulator, it gives you an uneven angle because how do I explain this? Yeah, so this is a good example, actually. When the phase accumulator and modulation signal are both being added together, when it's going up, it's at a steeper angle. And then when it's going down, it's at a less steep angle. And then it just goes back to 0. And so that's what gives you that pitch discrepancy, because otherwise you would expect it to be the same pitch going up and down because it would be going through the wave at the same rate on both sides, right? But since we're adding this to a phase accumulator, then it gives you this kind of shape, actually. So this is, except this is going to be a lot slower in this case, but it's going to have the same shape as it does there. So that's why it has a different pitch going up and down. And you can see if I turn up the frequency, you can see the more that I raise the frequency, the more space there is between the high note and then the low note. And that's because, again, the angles are changing. Because when it's steeper, it's going to play back at a faster frequency, and when it's less steep, it's going to be a lower frequency. So that happens with the modulation signal, because as you're increasing the frequency, the difference between the rising and the falling side of the triangle are going to be steeper. So that gives you a greater distance between the two pitches that it plays back. And again, if we try the frequency modulation one, it just gives you a totally different timbre, right? So it's not frequency modulating the waveform, but instead it's just adding another signal into the readback of the waveform. And since the signal that is being added to it is also linear, it's going to act in the same way that a phase accumulator does normally, except depending on the shape of the modulation signal that you're sending into it, it's going to behave differently. But what if I change the duty cycle a little bit? Now the rising edge is taking less time and the falling edge is taking more time. So you can hear it's playing faster for a little bit and then at a lower frequency for the rest of it. And all that corresponds to the shape of the modulation signal that we're sending into it. So that's what I meant when I said that using an actual saw wave isn't necessarily a good idea for phase modulation because it doesn't behave the way that you would expect it to, as it would in like a frequency modulation patch. Of course, there may be cool things that you can do to make this work. Like you could have something where you can change the duty cycle to make it sound kind of more interesting. I don't know. If you like the way that sounds, that is unfortunately incorrect to believe, but I don't know. I'm very particular about the way that things sound. So I wouldn't do something like that, but I don't know. More power to you if you can find a way to make it work. But that's what I meant when I said you should not use an actual saw wave as a modulation signal, because the saw wave is just like an inverse of the phase accumulator. So you're not going to get that much interesting sounds out of it, in my opinion. So now I'm just going to show you what it sounds like when the triangle as a modulator has a higher ratio than before. You can hear it kind of lands at harmonic intervals, and it sounds like a weird kind of sync sound. And that's because this modulation signal is just adding in these other sharp edges into the readback of the waveform, and then the sine wave kind of gets reconstructed at certain intervals, a higher pitch that corresponds to different harmonic intervals. So hopefully that helps you kind of wrap your head around how phase modulation actually works under the hood. For most intents and purposes, frequency modulation and phase modulation are similar enough that it doesn't really matter, especially if you're using sine waves or just curved waveforms with limited harmonics. I just think it's important to recognize like the functional difference between the two. Oh, also something important about phase modulation and that you can't do in the same way with frequency modulation is feedback. So I'm going to show you that next. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show you is feedback and the difference between FM feedback and PM feedback. I have the normal setup phase accumulator to table, and from the sine wave that we hear, I have this going into a history object, and what that does is it takes one sample from this, like the previous sample from this one, and that's it. And it's a really important tool for a lot of different things, like that's how you make filters and stuff. But what I'm going to do is take one sample behind, and then I'm going to take that and then send it back into itself. So that's going to be feedback. That's how you do feedback in phase modulation. The reason why I have to do one sample behind is that if I just go straight out of the cycle and back into itself, Gen isn't going to allow that. But this way there's a bit of a break in it, so it doesn't, it won't explode. So that will sound like our familiar phase modulation feedback situation. So you'll notice that in phase modulation feedback, it's playing back at the same frequency. It just starts to sound sharper. And the reason why it's playing back at the same frequency is because this phase accumulator is what's dictating the frequency. So when I add in a feedback loop, this phase accumulator is still going to keep track of the frequency of this, but the feedback loop is just going to add some chaos into the readback of the waveform. So that's unmistakably PM feedback. Now I'm going to show you what it sounds like when I do an FM setup with this. So again, with FM, instead of adding the signal to the readback of the waveform, I'm telling it to control the frequency of this phase accumulator. So let's listen to what that sounds like. So that's nothing like phase modulation. And that's because you're adding this kind of chaotic element into the phaser's frequency instead of just into the readback of the sine wave table. Because in phase modulation, it just adds some randomness to how you read back these different parts of the table, these different values of the table. Well, at first it kind of like straightens the waveform out a little bit, and then it just adds some chaos into it. That's where you get the noise part of feedback. But with FM feedback, you don't have the phase accumulator keeping track of the frequency, so it just sounds kind of weird. There are ways if you like hack it to get a more interesting sound out of FM feedback, but that's the basic like kind of FM feedback setup. It just gives you like this weird kind of waveform, like a big bowl, I guess. But yeah, the important part about that is that in phase modulation feedback, you have the phase accumulator that's still keeping track of the frequency. So it doesn't affect the frequency of the overall patch. So hopefully you have a better idea of what's going on in phase modulation now, and how it differs from frequency modulation, and how that difference, like under the hood, kind of amounts to a really small change. Again, adding the signal up here instead of after the phase accumulator. But hopefully that makes sense to you guys. If it doesn't, let me know if there's anything that's confusing about it. I'll try my best to answer, but no promises that I'll do a good job. So congratulations, you finished the lesson in PM versus FM. Now I just want to show you a couple of random extra things. So with this patch that I was using earlier, I kind of tricked you a little bit. As you can see, I have these numbers that indicate the range of these different signals. You have 0 to 1 for the phase accumulator, -1 to 1 for the, well, that's correct, the -1 to 1, but you know, the phase accumulator signal and stuff like that. I actually kind of tricked you with this, so I'm going to show you what's going on under the hood. I have this note here. The sine and cosine waves are derived from their respective trig functions instead of lookup tables. This means that the phase accumulators used needed to be multiplied by 2 pi. Because of this, the numbers shown here, as well as the control dials, have been scaled to depict 0 to 2 pi as 0 to 1. This is more similar to a traditional PM setup, and it's easier to wrap your head around what's going on. So what that means is that instead of using a phase accumulator to read through a sine lookup table, I have this phase accumulator, and I'm multiplying it by 2 pi, and then I'm taking the sine of it, and I'm also taking the cosine. So I'm doing the actual calculation of the sine wave instead of just reading through a wave table. I don't know, I just thought that was kind of interesting. So because the phase accumulator is 2 pi, I had to change the controls a little bit. Basically how that works is that 0 to 2 pi is the full range of angles in a circle. So the whole circumference of this circle is 2 pi. These sine and cos functions are expecting a value in radians, so anything that you send into it is converted into radians. And the range of values in radians is 0 to 2 pi. It would be 0, pi over 2, 1 pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi is at the end. And so in order to calculate this sine wave function, it has to go all the way from 0 to 2 pi instead of 0 to 1. If I just did 0 to 1 like normal, it would just go up to here and then start over again. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. It actually sounds better when you use it this way, but again, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's a bit more computationally expensive. But I like the way that it sounds better, and you don't have to do interpolation algorithms, because if you're using a table, and you're playing this back at different frequencies, you're going to need an algorithm to be able to interpolate between the different values of the table. Otherwise, you'll get artifacts of like stair steps, and you'll hear it. It's not the same as aliasing, but it's kind of similar. So depending on the frequency that you played the wavetable back, it'll sound kind of weird at some frequencies. So you need an interpolation algorithm to smooth out the transition between the different values, so it can play back more smoothly. But if you're just calculating the straight up sine, then there's no interpolation needed, because you don't have these different values that are stored in memory. You're just calculating the sine wave based on whatever value it is sent into it. So it's just a bit more of a smooth sound. So something else I found funny was that while I was making this video, this new Max for Live device by Forz dropped, and it actually does use frequency modulation and not phase modulation. One of the rare synths that do. It uses linear through zero frequency modulation. This is like a drum thing. And you have the two voices, and one of them can frequency modulate the other. So it's pretty fun to play around with. It's one of their few devices that sound more analog than they do digital. So let's read what they said on their website really quick. The voices collide with through zero linear FM, virtual analog core. So Dyad features beautifully imperfect virtual analog oscillators with through zero linear FM. Virtual analog? Okay, let's take a look at that a bit deeper. So this device comes bundled with some other ones, like basically the different modules of the device you can use on their own. So they have one where it's just the VCOs. So these are those supposed analog modeled VCOs. So let's take a look at what that actually is. So I think this is where the DSP is. Yeah, okay. Here's the code. Okay, so here are those quote-unquote virtual analog oscillators. So we have an operator here. The parameters are trig, frequency, multiple, phase modulation, and feedback. This is basically a base sine wave. And then for these different wave shapes, like the square oscillator, you have like 3 instances of that original sine wave operator, but it's set up suspiciously like phase modulation. So you have this operator at a multiple of 2, has a bit of feedback, and then the other operator is also at a multiple of 2. The phase modulation index is operator 0 times 0.125, and then a bit of feedback, and then this operator, it's at a multiple of 1, and then in the phase modulation, it's taking the signal from operator 1, then return op2. So here's the output carrier oscillator, and it's just a phase modulated square wave. Of course, being floors, all of their waveforms have to be FM, right? I just think it's really funny. It sounds great. I mean, it sounds like a really well and finely tuned square wave made out of FM. And then the saw wave too, right here. Same deal. It looks like a 3 operator little configuration. You got some modulation and then some feedback, and then it returns operator 2 right here, which is being modulated by operator 1, which is at a ratio of 1 with some feedback and amplitude. So I just thought that was really funny. I've looked at this company's the code of their other Max for Live devices, and pretty much whenever there's an oscillator, basically any wave shape, it's pretty much always guaranteed to be made with phase modulation. And I just think that's really fun. But then I saw this one, I was a bit confused at first. It's the sine oscillator, but there's some phase modulation going on here. So you have this operator, the multiple is -2, and then there's a bit of feedback going on. And it returns operator 1, which the modulation index is 0.25 plus operator 0 times 0.015, and then a bit of feedback. So I was like, why would they do that if it's a sine wave? Well, there's a reason for it. You can see that it's not perfect. It has these little notches in it, like that and that. And then here on EQ8, you can see that there's spikes in the spectrum, so it's not just a pure sine wave. So they modeled this like imperfect sine wave with these little notches and some extra frequencies built into it. And they did that using phase modulation, so it can sound more analog. I don't know, I just think that's really cool. And we can also try the FM on this and see what it sounds like. So that's through 0 frequency modulation. You can hear it sounds a lot more dirty, and it's because the wave shapes that you're starting with are imperfect, right? And being actual frequency modulation, it doesn't sound like it would if you're using a saw wave in phase modulation. And also through 0 modulation, it means that basically it's like the carrier's response is that when the modulator signal crosses to 0, then the carrier's response goes all the way down to 0, and then it goes negative. So it's like the full range positive, and then it goes negative, if that makes sense, the carrier. I think it's that it goes like from positive 20 hertz all the way down to negative 20 hertz again, and then back to positive. That's the response that the carrier has to the modulator signal. That might not make sense, but I don't know. You can go look it up if you really want to know. Yeah, there's a couple different types of scaling the response of the carrier for frequency modulation, and through 0 is one that's seems to be a bit more popular these days. I've only ever seen it implemented in hardware though, so it's kind of fun that there's a software version of this. Yeah, it's a fun little device. I can see myself using it a bit. It's not really the kind of timbre that I usually go for, but it sounds really good though. For what it is, it sounds basically like they nailed it. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, I just wanted to share that because I thought it was funny that it's an actual frequency modulation synth instead of phase modulation, but it's deceptively made with phase modulation. In fact, let me just show you the waveforms really quick. So that's the saw wave triangle. And you can see it kind of has that little notch thing, the way that you get with phase modulated triangle, like I showed in the FM tutorial video, how you can use negative modulation and negative feedback to get it. It didn't look like they used that configuration in the code, so I don't know, I could be wrong. I'm not very good at, deciphering code, but here's the pulse wave. So yeah, it's just fun that these were made with phase modulation. I don't know if you can change the pulse width. I don't know. I haven't figured out how to do that yet, if you can. Anyway, just a fun little thing. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you for watching. My next video, I want to talk a bit more about FM and talk about the way that I think it makes sense to think of FM. And I'm going to categorize it with a couple other synthesis methods. So I guess I just wanted to give another heuristic for understanding FM instead of outside of the slow LFO trick, because while that is true, speeding up a slow LFO until it sounds like a timbre, I don't think it tells you that much about why FM sounds the way it does. And so I just wanted to do a video of just maybe giving a better heuristic for people who are learning about FM. So yeah, thank you guys for your support. It's very much appreciated. It's just nice to know that it's helping people, I guess. And like I said, I'm not planning on turning this into a career, so but just for fun, I guess. I think about synths all the time, and yeah, I just think it's cool to share this kind of information. I wish that this is just stuff that I wish that that was in an easy to follow package when I was learning about it. So that's what I'm trying to do here today. So, all right, thank you.